So welcome back to the Defiant Spirit and the Defy Your Number Enneagram System. I am Baruch Levy, also known as B, and I am delighted and honored you tuned in, or you keep tuning in to our conversations about all things Viktor Frankl, founder of Logotherapy, meaning-centered psychotherapy, my mentor and teacher in life, and the Enneagram, an ancient personality typing system, but I think of it more as a roadmap to live out the philosophy of Dr. Frankl. If I had to boil down Dr. Frankl's lifetime of work of logotherapy into a nutshell, I would say it is the ability to stop reacting to our circumstances and take back our power to choose our response in life. And so the Enneagram is just the finest roadmap I have ever discovered in doing just that, in learning where I go in reaction and how I stop reacting and where I can go in response, how to choose my response. So there are 9 fundamental ways we react and we respond. Oftentimes we talk about it in relation to ourselves, and I want to shift gears a little bit today and talk about it in relation to other people. Actually, I did do a podcast a couple weeks ago on Valentine's Day around that very notion, to be able to see what other people need, what other people want, to give them, right, their Valentine's Day version of love. You know, we all have different love languages. Well, we have different Enneagram types. And today I want to talk about the Enneagram blind spots. One of the things the Enneagram is all about is pointing out our blind spots. You know, when you're driving down the street, and this day and age, most cars now come equipped with, on the side, the mirrors light up and it shows you somebody's in your blind spot. Well, I think in some ways that's what the Enneagram accomplishes for me and for those whom I share it with. It shows us our blind spots, where we go, and we don't mean to, but we end up crashing because we just didn't see anybody back there. So there are 9 fundamental kind of blind spots, if you will. Now, in the ancient world, my old job, my old profession, we called it stumbling blocks. And it came from an ancient wisdom text, the Bible, a famous passage, very famous. I think it's Leviticus, I can't remember now. But it talks about not placing a stumbling block in front of the blind. And of course, that has to do with, literally, don't place stumbling blocks in front of blind people. That's just god awful. But more than that, it was a metaphor for becoming sensitive, sensitized to not just the needs of others, the wants of others, or other people's love language, but also what trips people up, what causes them to stumble. And the rabbinic tradition, anyways, took that in a very sophisticated direction, talking about all kinds of scenarios in the Talmud of what are stumbling blocks before the blind. So I remember reading one commentary on it that talked about, I'm not putting wine in front of a person who you know is a recovering alcoholic, somebody who struggles with that particular addiction. And probably isn't going to happen intentionally, but even unintentionally, it's still a stumbling block. It's a blind spot. So if you know somebody is a recovering addict, maybe you forego serving wine at your dinner party in honor of them. Now, maybe you do serve it, but you acknowledge the struggle, or you don't put the wine cup in front of them, or you take them off to the side, or whatever it is. The point, though, is not the outcome so much as the process, sensitizing us to other people's blind spots, to their weakness, to their struggles, because what seems like a struggle to them may very well not be my struggle, and I just may be oblivious to it and not realize that it's not just a struggle. I mean, in that particular case, it's an addiction. It can destroy lives. Somebody who's 1,000 days sober, God forbid, I'm the one who trips them up. So you could say, well, that's not my fault, but not my responsibility. But the whole point of the Enneagram, of these ancient wisdom traditions, of religion, is to soften us, is to sensitize us, is to make us more compassionate. Calm means with, passion means suffering, is to be with other people in their suffering. And so in order to and in order to mitigate that suffering, to bring down their suffering, to become aware of what is suffering to them versus somebody else. So I want to look at that ancient wisdom text in a modern context, the Enneagram. because it's still applicable thousands of years later. And I do believe that one of the things the Enneagram can do is sensitize us, excuse me, to how other people move through the world and the struggles that they face, the blind spots that they don't even know exist in their life and they end up crashing into. So 9 stumbling blocks before the blind, and our opportunity, if not obligation, to be aware of them and to remove them. Certainly not place them in front of the blind, place them in front of the person struggling with that particular blind spot or that issue, but even going out of our way to removing them without having to be asked. And that's, again, what the Enneagram can really empower us to do. Okay, let's start with Enneagram 1 up in the right-hand corner. By the way, if you're not watching, if you're just listening, totally fine. You can get this slide on my website on the podcast page. Scroll to the bottom and I'm putting up there all the infographics. So this will be there, but I'll walk you through it. I'll talk you through it. You're not missing that much. It just helps me stay on track and kind of gives me a focal point. Okay, Enneagram 1, oftentimes known as the reformer and sometimes referred to as the perfectionist. And that is part of the blind spot of a 1. So here are some of the stumbling blocks or the blind spots I can think of off the top of my head for a 1. And 1 is perfection or imperfection. They just struggle with it. You know, many types are going to get into perfectionism, but it's not a drug of choice for most types, but it is for a 1. You know, for me as an 8, like I'm not detail oriented. I'm big picture. So I miss the I's, dotting the I's and crossing the T's and whatever. People kind of expect that from me. I expect it from myself. It just doesn't eat me up. I know Enneagram 1s where when they don't check off all the tasks on their to-do list, they start beating themselves up. When they, deliver a product or a service and there's a complaint, it hits them harder than it would hit me or some other types. So just knowing that an Enneagram 1 really struggles with the blind spot or the stumbling block around perfection. Because for a 1, again, this is all reactive and we can defy our reaction. We can grow, do the work and start responding. But I'm sharing with you at a primal level, unconsciously, when they're tired, when they're in doubt, when they're in fear, when they're beaten down, it's a trigger for a 1. It sends them down a hole of not just that it's not perfect, but I'm not perfect. And that's really how you know you're in the realm of somebody's stumbling block, when it starts to qualify their worth as a human being. And 1s can get into that pretty quickly. 1s struggle around issues of perfection, being imperfect, not being perfect. They struggle around morality. They long to be good. They want to be good, but they have a fundamental sort of original sin kind of a thing going on inside of them where they just fundamentally feel flawed or immoral. And so they're often trying to stand guard against immorality, imperfection, order, structure. It's very hard sometimes for a 1 to live in chaos. So if I know these things, I can tread lightly. I can know that, if I invite a 1 over, it isn't that they're judging my house if it's messy. It's just that they feel uncomfortable. My son comes home from college, and if his room is, been messed with, he can feel that. And so, because he's a 1. And so really going out of our way to make sure everything's in order. Now, again, he or the 1 has to deal with their struggles, but it's sensitizing me to something that just otherwise I wouldn't be sensitive to. Another big one, and we'll move on, is criticism. So 1s are the most critical of others, but by and large, critical of themselves. Well, when I start criticizing a 1, like my son, I can feel it is a stumbling block. I can feel him falling over in a way that God bless her, my 8 daughter, I could criticize her all day long and she's got like elephant skin. It like bounces off. But him, it really hits him hard. And our relationship has gotten so much better now that I've understood that's a stumbling block. And I have to help him remove the criticism, not add more to it. So as you go through your day and you know your 1s, just keep these things in mind. These are all stumbling blocks. setting off a 1. There's many more, of course, but these are some of them. And can we start seeing them through this lens and sensitizing ourselves and helping them bring down some of that imperfection, some of that struggle with order, some of those struggle with the details, and all of that. Okay, moving on to Enneagram 2. So Enneagram 2, the helper, all about relationships, connection, giving. They're the ultimate givers. They struggle with receiving. This is kind of the converse of it. And so perfection for the ones, imperfection is a struggle. Giving, 2s give naturally. They have a hard time receiving. So a stumbling block before the blind with the 2. 2s are blind around receiving presents, receiving attention, receiving the very thing that they gave us. Oftentimes you'll ask a 2, is there anything you need? They just lost a loved one, or they're sick, or they're struggling. I'm fine. Well, that's a stumbling block. Don't even ask a 2 if you can do something for them, because that's a stumbling block. See, they struggle with it, and they're going to say no because that's their reaction. Again, if they're in reaction, they can learn to say yes. I know many 2s who have done the work. Nancy, thank you for this inspiration. My friend Nancy's a 2, inspired me to this particular podcast. So just do for the 2. Just bring them the chicken soup if you know that they have a cold, and don't ask if you can do it, because again, they'll probably naturally say no, but that doesn't mean they mean no. Another stumbling block is asking them for help, asking them to pick you up at the airport at 3 a.m. It doesn't mean you can't, but just know that a 2 will probably say yes, even if they mean no, or they don't want to, or they can't, because it's so hard for them to say no. And so I might say, well, I know she's going to say yes, and I don't know if that's really fair. So I'm going to not place that stumbling block before her particular blindness or his particular blindness. Another one with 2s is they are very sensitive. When you're this thoughtful and giving and you want to be in relationship, they can be some of the most sensitive people. And so just knowing a stumbling block for them might be criticism. Now, it doesn't mean you refrain from sharing important feedback, but you just do it mindfully. Again, certain types are not going to hear criticism the same way other types are. So you can say it directly to a 5 or to an 8. To a 2, you might not say it at all, or you certainly might need to crouch it something sweet before something, salty. So just keeping in mind who they are and what they struggle with, and not going out of our way to place a stumbling block, but also going out of our way to remove some of those. Enneagram 3. Enneagram 3, the achiever, the producer, the performer. They're out front, they're seen, they're doing. Many stumbling blocks for 3s. Here's one of them. If producing is really how they value themselves, as Wayne Dyer says, they're the human doings, not the human beings. They struggle with being enough without doing. So if I ask a 3 to do something, they're probably going to get it done. They're probably going to say yes. They're probably going to do it. Whereas the 2 might not be able to say no around relationship. A 3 might not be able to say no around, a task or a chore or a challenge, challenging them, right? Getting into that, maybe you're not capable of doing it. Maybe, you don't know how to do it type of thing, kind of baiting them into something can be a stumbling block. They oftentimes say yes, and they become overdoers, workaholics. So if you have an employee that's a 3 and you know it, and everybody talks about it and they pride themselves on it, asking them to forego a family vacation or stay the Saturday to work, when in fact you know that they need some quality family time because that's in their best interest, but you also know they can't say no, that's a stumbling block before the blind. Another big one for 3s, I think, is honesty, and it's not their fault. We live in a world that encourages 3s to be dishonest, to fudge the truth. We want to hear the winner, in them. If there are financial, our financial advisor, for instance. We want them to tell us how great it is. We don't say that, but that's what we want to hear. Or, just 1,000 different, I think of athletes, professional athletes. How many of them have ended up crossing a line like Lance Armstrong and Tiger Woods and Barry Bonds and Mark McGwire and Pete Rose, all threes. Not coincidentally, all threes, we pushed them so hard. Now they got to take responsibility for their mistakes, for their choices. But we also, as a society, have really set a lot of stumbling blocks before the blind when we ask them to be superhuman and to give us more and more and more. And then they cross that line. And people I just named, I don't think any of them set out to cross lines. I think what happened is they're just dishonest about, it's not steroids, it's just whatever that, stuff McGwire was on. It's not quite illegal, but it's pretty illegal. It's like they're on the edge of the truth, and that's where threes can get into some trouble. Threes can start fudging the truth, and in many ways we encourage them. Look at Bernie Madoff. I'm not saying his victims are to blame. I am saying if you're getting 20% returns every single year without fail, and you don't want to see that might be a problem, you have to own some of that. And then we're encouraging this. Again, he has to take responsibility for his choices, but at the same time, we have to take responsibility for stumbling blocks that we place in front of threes or any type. And in this case, really getting them to not have to lie, to not be in a position where they may fudge the truth, and not asking them to go above and beyond in a way that's just detrimental to their well-being. Enneagram 4. Enneagram 4 is the individualist, the romantic, the artist. They are all about self-expression. And they live with this perennial feeling like it's never enough. What they're sharing, that they need to be more special, more unique, more creative and artistic and stand out. And so they really grapple with worthiness, being mindful of that, just how sensitive. I mean, 2s are the second most sensitive type, in my opinion. 4s are the most sensitive type. So here's a stumbling block before the blind. I've learned this because I've been blind. My wife, Ariella, as you probably know, is a 4. I've talked about it quite often. And the worst thing I can say to a 4 is you're being too sensitive, right? Making her feelings wrong. 4s navigate with their feelings, and it sets them off because they already feel like they're not like everybody else. And in some ways they're not. They just feel so much deeper than your average type. And so not doing that to them, not adding to their unworthiness, feeling like they're failure. You shouldn't do it to anybody, but this is a particular stumbling block for the 4. The kid comes home and hands you a piece of art. If they're a 4, it's a expression of who they are. If they're a 3, they probably, threw it together to get a passing grade. But a 4 actually invested themselves into that piece of art. They invest themselves into everything. So there's a sensitivity that we must conjure up with a 4 that maybe we don't have to with other types. And so not tripping them up, not getting them to shut down by discounting, right, their contribution to the world, just being very sensitive to their sensitivity. Anything else with a 4? 4s really thrive on drama. That's how they feel. And so not adding to the drama. Maybe that's like not telling them something somebody said about them. I'm not saying you lie. I'm not saying you hide. But I think part of my work with my 4s is to filter and share what's actually necessary and important and what's just going to flame up this situation and isn't necessary. So really being considerate about how much drama and turmoil they live with on the inside. Okay, Enneagram 5s, the investigator. This is also a dark, deep type, but it's more intellectual. So they are just constant thinkers. They tend towards retreat into themselves. So one of the things is they just like to, they need to understand the world. And here's a trivial one, but they don't like surprises. So a stumbling block before the blind for a 5 might be to pop in, unannounced to their office or to their home, knocking on the door without calling ahead of time. If you're visiting them at home, or surprise birthday parties. I've heard multiple 5s say they just hate it. And if you don't honor that and you have one anyways, right, that's for you, it's not for them. So a stumbling block for the blind because they have a slower, more powerful, but slower processing speed. And a surprise doesn't give them time to understand and to open up. So they're going to close down at the birthday party. And you can imagine that's a stumbling block for the blind. Another thing a 5 will tend to do is conserve. It isn't that they're cheap, they're just conservationists. They conserve resources because they always feel like things are running out. And they really struggle with opening up, with giving. So random, but if you have a 5 in your leadership team, as an example, I've seen this. Don't demand that they give you an answer at the board meeting when all the 7s are throwing out answers and brainstorming. That's a stumbling block for the blind. They don't think as fast. They think deeper. They're smarter, but it takes time. They don't like surprises. It's hard for them to open up. It's sort of like demanding that a shy child speak out, speak up, right? That doesn't work. Telling a kid to speak up, it just sends them down a shame spiral. And I think 5s, 4s and 5s are introverted, and it's not fair to demand that they live according to our rules. It puts a stumbling block in front of them. Another one for 4s, just jumping back real quickly, is suffering. 4s don't want to get out of their struggle, their suffering as quickly as everybody else. So I saw this one a lot when I was a rabbi with Enneagram 4 types, where they're in mourning and it's past a year and people around them will say, you need to get over it, right? Get over it. That is not a fair statement to say to anybody, but especially a 4, because if they could, they would, but they can't, and they're stuck in it. Now, you can help them transcend it, but saying get over it sends them down that trips them up over their stumbling block and sends them down a shame spiral. Okay, Enneagram 6. This is the loyalist. This is the most anxious type. It's the most loyal type. It's the most sort of need to belong, and you can trip 6s up in 1,000 different ways with stumbling blocks. So one would be to withhold your support, right? Almost weaponize your support or their belonging. You see this all the time in high school and junior high school groups, friend groups, especially with young girls, teenage girls. I see it with my girls. That those groups, they weaponize belonging. And so for an 8, my daughter would be like, screw you, I'm out. But for a 6, there's a feeling of I'm left alone, to fend for myself with the wolves. Like that's a stumbling block because it's so primal for a 6 when they feel like they're left on the outside, they're isolated, they're abandoned. So making sure we're very sensitive to not leaving them out in the cold. Now, maybe we're not weaponizing it. Maybe we just weren't thinking about it. And we know that, we're having a birthday party and we invited half the staff, but we didn't invite this one person. They're 6. And, that can be a stumbling block. It can really send them down a path of despair. Anxiety, a big one, big one. So I just dealt with this with a company where they're making people come back to the office, which is absolutely the prerogative of a business. But they have a 6 who's really reluctant because the coronavirus or flu or something was going around the office, and yet they were still really encouraging people to come back. And the 6 I talked to was like hyperventilating. It was sending her down this fear spiral of a couple years ago, type stuff when it comes to COVID. And nobody else could understand it, but that's not their stumbling block. For her, it was really getting into issues of self-preservation. So just being very sensitive to a 6. 6s need to ask a ton of questions to feel secure. So a stumbling block might be no more questions, right? Just a teacher saying that to a student, no more questions. Well, that's fine if the certain type is asking too many questions, or they're just being a nudnik, a pain in the ass or something. But if a 6 is asking that, and I know that, I know what they're doing is they're trying to feel safe and secure. So not causing them to trip up over these types of issues. Enneagram 7. Oof, this is a big one. 7s are the enthusiasts, the fun ones, the larger than life personalities, the visionaries. They're fast paced. They're up for a good time. This one is a kind of a traditional stumbling block, that gluttony thing, that inviting them out to a bar when you know that they're really struggling with alcohol, or maybe they go out too much. I've heard this from a lot of spouses of 7s, that it seems like their spouse is just out too often. So if my good buddy's a 7 and I know that he's struggling with his marriage, I may not ask him to go out. Maybe I'll, if we want to do something, maybe I'll go over to their house. Being very sensitive to how hard it is for a 7, because 7s don't want to miss out. They got FOMO. So being very conscious about that. They have a hard time with excess. They tend towards excess. So, a little becomes a lot. And you see this around food with 7s. You see it around all kinds of narcotics with 7s. You see it around experience, like road trip with 7s. They just can get away from themselves. Another one is they struggle with suffering, with going darker and deeper. And they'll tell jokes. So I have a harder time helping 7s in grief counseling than I do any other type, because they really tend to resist going into the darkness. I call it the void dance, a void dance, a dance around the void. They're the most avoidant type around these harder conversations. So they're the most likely to be funny, to be fun, to crack jokes. A stumbling block, if I try and get them to be funny, or if I play into those jokes and I encourage more, or I let them co-opt the conversation, take us in a different direction. 7s do this all the time. They're masters at diversion. And if I play into that and keep kind of feeding them more and more and more, letting them take me down this path of diversion, it's a stumbling block. They're going away from the hard conversation they need to have. Lots of them with 7s. 8, Enneagram 8. So I react and respond like this type. I'd say the biggest one I can think of for me or for 8s is, we want to live with impact, do big things, make a difference. We have a hard time with the mundane. I think that's a big one. So if you don't want to get me going, all you have to do is throw a cause at me or almost challenge me. We look a lot like 3s in that way. Like, it's hard for me not to take on a cause. So if I know somebody's an 8 and I know they're sitting on 3 boards for NGOs for worthy causes, and I know that they're stretched and they're not paying enough attention to their home life, and I invite them to be on a 4th board, that's a stumbling block. Again, it's on them to say no, but at the same time, if they're a friend, or if I know who they are and I know what they're struggling with, then it's on me to not place additional stumbling blocks before them. So, this is a dumb one, but when I was like 20 years old, somebody dragged me into a fight, a fist fight. And it wasn't even my fight, but the way they said it to me was, you're just going to let us get pummeled over here. And they were wrong. Like, I was trying to get them out of their bad situation, and they dragged me into it by playing on my, you're going to leave a brother, in arms on the battlefield type thing. It's on me. I was a stupid 20-year-old and I got into that fight, but I allowed myself to be dragged in, but much lesser than a fist fight, knowing that 8s have a hard time staying out of something. I've seen many 8s cross over in family fights, being kind of dragged in to one side or the other. And it's very disruptive to the soul of an 8 to be put in that position. And so just knowing how much they struggle with coming to the defense of people, and they'll do it even if the person is wrong. And so just because they have a deep sense of loyalty and justice. Another one is vulnerability. I know this firsthand. We have a very hard time being vulnerable. So when I'm in group settings and am almost demanded that I share, I've been in those groups where it's like, it's your turn and you need to share. And I'm not yet comfortable. I don't feel secure. I can feel myself like shutting down, and there's this pressure. And if I know somebody's an 8, I'm going to know that they'll share. But but it's got to be on their time frame in their terms. So not demanding and 8 do anything, frankly, because that's a stumbling block. 8s really recoil at demands. They will come along, but they have to feel like it's on their own terms. Okay, lastly, 9. This one is a big one too. 9s are the peacemaker. They're the unifiers. They are amazing at bringing harmony to the world, but they struggle around conflict. So, that back to what I just said about the 8s, true with the 9s, dragging them into a fight to choose sides. We have a daughter, right? We have 2 daughters. One of them's a 9, and she's caught in the middle of her siblings. She's got 3 siblings, and 2 of them in particular. Her sister is an 8 and her brother's a 1, literally on the Enneagram. They're on either side of her, and they have been known to war with each other, and they'll make her choose sides. And you can just see it's such a stumbling block because she can't willingly enter into conflict. For an 8, it's more about, justice, and it's so hard for an 8 to stand with somebody who's wrong, but they'll do it out of loyalty. Well, for a 9, it's just hard to stand with anybody in conflict. Don't make them choose. Don't push them into conflict. They need to learn how to deal with it, but it's got to be on their terms. Another big one, like 9s and 2s have the same struggle. 9s have a hard time saying no. I've seen it with Shosh, my daughter. Her siblings will prey upon this at times, knowing that she can't say no. My daughter Maya just made her buy her Starbucks the other day because Maya drives Shosh to school, but I pay Maya to drive Shosh to school. So Maya guilted Shosh into buying a Starbucks, and Shosh just couldn't say no. And she told me afterwards, and I laid into Maya, and Maya basically said, well, I just knew she wouldn't be able to say no. So that's a stumbling block before the blind, right? You got to know that about somebody, and it's our obligation not to prey upon that, to remove those things. Yes, Shosh and 9s need to learn how to use their voice and say no. But if we care about our 9s, need to be very sensitive to just how hard it is. Here's another one. I've talked about this one before. I've seen this with lots of 9s. I've heard it over and over again. So if you ask a 9 if they want to go out to eat, they say yes, and you say to them, where do you want to go? The most likely answer for a 9 is, I don't care, wherever you want to go. That's not true, but they don't want to cause conflict. So we had a Shosh day on our vacation last summer, I think it was, where just to help her grow through some of this, we said the entire day is going to be about Shosh choosing where we go. Nobody gets to argue with her. Nobody gets to challenge her. Nobody gets to give her a raised eyebrow. And we just go where she wants to go. And it was liberating for her. It's like we removed some stumbling blocks. In the past, when I've asked her, do you want, Chinese or Japanese or Mexican food, and let's say Shosh chooses Japanese, part of me, and I didn't want Japanese, part of me wants to go back and go, how about Mexican? But that's a stumbling block because it took her a tremendous amount to voice her wants and needs. And now for me to go back and challenge that, she'll probably crumble. She'd probably get Mexican if I pushed her. But that's a stumbling block. So really just being sensitive to how hard it is for a 9 to use their voice, to make their stand, and once they do, to honor and respect it. They don't do conflict. And those are just some ways to think about the Enneagram, to bring this ancient biblical text to modern life and to live a better life so that we don't go groping through the dark in our relationships and the way we treat people. How do we do that? By this roadmap. It is an incredible roadmap. When I know somebody's Enneagram type, it isn't so that I can box them in to reduce them, to make them a number, God forbid. It's so that I can stop reducing them, to stop treating them like just any old person. I now know their roadmap. I know their blueprints, and I can address them, their needs. I can help them win. I can help them succeed by not placing stumbling blocks in front of them when they can't see them, but even more than that, going from just neutral to good and being a good person by removing those obstacles, those stumbling blocks before them in their blind spots. And we all have blind spots. If you want more, jump over to defiantspirit.org. You can get my complimentary ebook on 9 Enneagram types. Walk into a bar, and this is what they struggle with, this is how they react, and this is how they respond. Check that out. Check out my Defy Your Number Enneagram program, where you can take the test, you can get into your online program walks you through everything you need to discover your number and defy your number. Until then, I will see you or talk to you in the next podcast.